For this lecture, we're going to be looking at Chapter 1 of Doing Ethics by Lewis Vaughan, and we're in the 5th edition of this textbook. This is Part 1 of this chapter, and we're going to be having another lecture after this, Part 2. But for this lecture, we want to get some basic vocabulary down and some basic concepts of what it means to be doing ethics or what it means to be doing moral philosophy. So we'll just start with a basic definition of ethics. So ethics is sometimes called moral philosophy, and one of the things that I like to point out to first semester ethics students is that ethics is really a philosophy class. It's a branch of philosophy. Sometimes students don't know that. So this is the philosophical study of morality. That's what ethics is. So we're going to be doing philosophy this semester as we're doing ethics. Another definition that I like to give, this doesn't come from your textbook, but this is just a common definition that I use, is that ethics is simply thinking hard and precisely about moral and social issues. So whenever you're doing that, you are doing ethics, which leads to a basic question. What do you mean doing ethics? What does it mean to be doing ethics? Well, any time that you're say deliberating about the rightness or wrongness of an action. You're trying to figure out, is this a good act or is this a bad act? You're doing ethics. If you're making any sort of judgments, so judgment about the goodness of your own character or your intentions, or about somebody else's character or intentions, you're doing ethics. So this is something that we do all of the time, anytime that we make any sort of judgment. If you're examining the soundness or the reasonableness of your moral outlook on life, that is also doing ethics. Or if you're simply questioning whether or not a moral decision that you're making rests upon coherent presuppositions. All of these types of things, when you're doing it, you'll be doing ethics. And one of the things that I hope that we can do this semester is to have a lot of practice of doing ethics together, as we look at different case studies and as we think about different moral issues, we'll be essentially doing ethics together in this class. So some of the types of questions that you might ask in a ethics class would be things like, what is the greatest good? Now, this is a question that is really getting at first principles. So is the greatest good to, say, get a good grade in a class? So you're all taking an ethics class right now, and presumably you're going to be studying this semester for ethics. Well, if somebody asks you, why are you studying for your ethics class? You might give a reason, such as, I want to get a good grade. So getting a good grade, you might see as a deeper good to studying for the exam. But if you're studying for the exam for an ethics class, and you want to do that to get a good grade, well, of course, somebody could follow up with that question and ask, well, why do you want to get a good grade? Well, now you have to seek to unveil a deeper good. So your deeper good might be because you want to get a good GPA in college, so that when you graduate college, you'll get a good job. So now you're finding a deeper good. I want to get a good job, and that's why I'm studying, so that I get a good grade, is so that I get a good job. But of course, somebody could ask you, well, why do you want to get a good job? And if you dig down a little bit deeper, you need to give an even deeper good. And you might say, well, because I want to be happy. Now, of course, somebody could ask, well, why do you want to do that? On and on. But one of the questions that we want to figure out in ethics is there a greatest good? Or is there a deepest level for which you don't go deeper than that? So for some people, happiness might just be the greatest good. So at bottom, the reason why we do the things that we do is because we want to achieve happiness. Whatever that means, we want to achieve it. So for some, the greatest good would be happiness. So when you ask that question, is that the greatest good? You're asking an ethical question. And this leads into questions like, what goals should I pursue in life? What career should I should I go into? That is an ethical question. And what virtues should I cultivate? And when we're talking about virtues, we're going to be studying virtue ethics a few weeks from now. But virtue ethics is really a study of someone's character. At least that's part of what virtue ethics is. So when you're thinking about ethics from a virtue perspective, we're not only concerned about what it means to be doing the right actions, we're also concerned about what does it mean to become a moral person? What does it mean to develop or to cultivate virtues in my life so that I have a moral and ethical character? So when we're talking about virtues, what virtues should I cultivate? Those types of questions are also questions of ethics. There are different divisions that I think are helpful for us to explore here briefly, different divisions of ethics. And these are helpful to think about. There's helpful distinctions that we need to understand so that we know exactly what we're going to be covering in this class. So there's what your textbook calls descriptive ethics. I like to think of this in terms of, say, sociology or psychology. So descriptive ethics would be simply the scientific study of moral beliefs and practices. So when you're doing this type of ethics, you might be studying a particular culture and you're trying to figure out what values that culture has, what moral practices they engage in, and then you can compare them with another culture. But when you're doing descriptive ethics, you're not making any judgments between cultures. All you're trying to do is just describe how different cultures behave. If you do this more at the individual level, you might be looking at how different individuals behave, but you're not making any judgments upon whether or not those moral behaviors are actually moral or whether they're immoral. So descriptive ethics, I say this is closely related to sociology and psychology, because if that's all we had in ethics, I don't think we would actually have ethics as a branch of study. And here's what I mean. If all we had were descriptive ethics, then really ethics would just be a subset of sociology, if we're looking at cultures, or of psychology, if we're looking at individuals. And so what I like to say in all of my classes is that when you're taking an ethics class, this really is a philosophical class. And what I mean is we're not just trying to describe how different cultures behave. What we want to do is the hard work of trying to figure out, is there any basis, are there any principles for determining whether or not one set of ethics is superior to another? Now, at the end of that analysis, we might determine there is no standard or there is no principle that helps us determine that. But we don't want to come to that conclusion too quickly. We want to first do the analysis and figure out if that is actually a reasonable conclusion. So we are, in this course, mainly going to be focused on philosophy. Now, under philosophy, there are 3 more divisions of ethics, and I want to take some time to walk through these divisions. So there's normative ethics, there's meta-ethics, and there's applied ethics. We'll be focusing on all 3 of these throughout the semester, so it might be helpful to walk through each of these briefly. So we'll start with normative ethics. Normative ethics is the study of the principles, rules, or theories that guide moral action. And the purpose of doing normative ethics is to try to establish the soundness or the reasonableness of moral norms. So when you're asking questions within a normative ethic framework, these might include things like, is happiness the greatest good in life? Should the rightness of actions be judged by their consequences? So we might look at 3 examples. Now, you don't have to, at this point, have a full grasp of these 3 examples, because as the semester goes on, we're going to dive into each of these. But I just want to bring up these 3 examples as an illustration here briefly. So let's suppose we have 3 people, Sarah, Miles, and Jordan. And they're debating what is the best basis for morals, or what is the superior moral principle. Well, Sarah is a utilitarian. Now, if you're a utilitarian, you usually mean something like this. So a utilitarian will probably say that we should promote a principle of ethics that is promoting the greatest happiness for the greatest amount of people. Or you could say that in the negative. You could say the principle, the ethical principle that we ought to promote is a principle that promotes, or I should say it this way, that reduces suffering for the most amount of people. That's a similar principle, it's just put in the negative. So either we want to promote happiness for the most amount of people, or we want to reduce suffering for the most amount of people. That, in a nutshell, is the utilitarian principle. So Sarah is a utilitarian. Miles, on the other hand, is not a utilitarian. He rejects that principle and instead argues for what's called libertarianism. This principle simply says that the morally right thing to do is that which protects the rights of every individual, so long as in protecting those rights, you're not infringing upon the rights of anyone else. Well, right away, there's a conflict between Sarah and Miles. So in Sarah's ethical worldview, there will be cases where you're not concerned about what the minority wants because the minority, by definition, are not the most amount of people. So if Sarah is concerned about what makes the most amount of people happy, well, that leaves out the minority. Miles, being a libertarian, is actually for the minority at the individual level. So you can't get more minority than that. Is he looks at every individual, and that's what ethics ought to be about. We ought to protect the free rights of every person so long as they don't use those rights to infringe upon somebody else's rights. Well, then Jordan comes along and listens to Miles and Sarah debate about what the deepest principle should be. And Jordan says, I think both of you are wrong. I think what we should actually be promoting is fairness, equal rights. That's the egalitarian principle. That's the deepest principle if you're an egalitarian. Whatever leads to the greatest amount of equality for the most amount of people, that is the ethical principle that we should be living by. Well, when we engage in debates about which of these principles are more coherent or sound, we are doing normative ethics. And we'll be doing a lot of that this semester. The second concept is metaethics. So this is the study of the meaning and logical structures of moral beliefs. And the purpose of metaethics is to question assumptions that inform normative ethics. So here are some questions that you might ask in metaethics. On what grounds can a moral principle be justified? Or we might ask, is there such a thing as moral truth at all? Oftentimes when we have debates about religion and morality and the relationship between religion and morality, and we're actually going to do this in our next lecture for this chapter, you're engaging in metaethics when you're talking about the relationship between religion and morality. So if we think about Sarah, Miles, and Jordan, then from a metaethical perspective, and they're debating utilitarianism versus libertarianism versus egalitarianism, if we come along and then we ask, well, by what standard can this debate be adjudicated? By what standard can we determine who's right in this debate? When you start asking a question at that level, you're engaging in metaethics. When you start asking whether or not there are really moral truths, you're doing metaethics. Is moral truth objective and can be discovered? Or are moral truths relative and therefore they're invented by an individual or by a culture? Those types of questions are metaethical questions, and we'll be engaging in metaethics this semester. Last is applied ethics. And we're going to be engaging in applied ethics toward the end of this semester. But this is where you look at specific questions that people are interested in. Sometimes these questions are controversial, sometimes they're not as controversial. But one example of an applied ethical question would be this: is physician-assisted suicide morally permissible? If you ask a specific question like that, that's relevant right now in the real world, you are doing applied ethics. Now, Sarah, Miles, and Jordan can be debating about whether or not physician-assisted suicide is morally permissible. And let's just pretend for the moment that Sarah says yes, Miles says no, and Jordan says maybe. Jordan's undecided. Well, if you ask Sarah, okay, how did you justify answering in the affirmative? If Sarah says, I think that physician-assisted suicide is morally permissible because by permitting physician-assisted suicide, in the long run, we will actually contribute to the greatest overall happiness for the most amount of people. Or if Sarah says, I actually think it's morally permissible because it will reduce suffering for the most amount of people who are involved in the situation. Well, when Sarah answers that way and justifies her answer in the way that she did, she is acting like a consistent utilitarian. Now, I don't want to imply here for a moment that a utilitarian has to answer this way. I'm just giving you an example that Sarah, being a utilitarian, this might be how she would answer this as a utilitarian. Miles, on the other hand, says, no, we ought to protect the rights of everyone, and if somebody is wanting to take their own life, Miles says that person might not be in the right mental state to make that decision, and therefore we don't want to infringe upon the life of this person. So the libertarian wants to protect the life of an individual, the free rights of an individual, and anyone who wants to take their own life, Miles argues, is not in the right state of mind. Well, this could be one way that a libertarian might argue, and whether Miles is right or wrong, that's beside the point right now. We're just trying to see how he's thinking through it. And then Jordan says, well, maybe if this is done fairly, if physician-assisted suicide is done in a fair way so that everyone is treated equally, then yes. If it's not done in a fair way, then Jordan might say no. But this is a person who now is arguing from a consistent egalitarian perspective. Now, when we're doing applied ethics and we're looking at a specific question like this, some people, some ethicists, like to look at all the moral principles, the normative moral principles, and if you can make a compelling utilitarian argument for saying, yes, physician-assisted suicide should be morally permissible, and you can also make a compelling libertarian argument, and you can make a compelling egalitarian argument, if all three of these are leading to, arguably leading to the same conclusion on this question, then some ethicists will say this is a very strong way to argue when it comes to ethics, because you're showing that three different principles support the same conclusion, and if you can do that, that makes your case strong. So we will stop here for this lecture. I just wanted to introduce you to the basic concepts in ethics. In the next part of this chapter, we are going to be looking at specifically a meta-ethical question related to the nature of religion and morality, and more specifically, whether or not God is necessary for morality. And so that's what we'll look at in the next lecture.